You are looking at a man in a bulletproof glass booth. The acoustics muffle all external sounds. There is nothing remarkable about his face. Nothing at all. He is an ordinary clerk with thick, horn-rimmed glasses, balding and stooped. He nervously adjusts his papers. Yet he stands accused of orchestrating the methodical, industrial-scale death of millions, of creating a death machine that operated with factory-like efficiency. You listen to his monotonous voice, filtering through the translator's headphones, filled with bureaucratic jargon. You study his dry, emotionless gestures, and you wait. You wait for the shadow of a monster to flicker behind this mask of an office drone, for a cold, calculating cruelty to emerge, a fanatical fury in his eyes, a diabolical charisma capable of leading legions. You wait to see the embodiment of pure, absolute evil, to finally exhale and say, there he is, the enemy. But the monster isn't there. Worse, he never was. 6 different court-appointed psychiatrists who examined him reached the same conclusion. A stunning, blood-chilling conclusion. The man is perfectly normal. One of the doctors even added, more normal than I am after examining him. More normal than his judge, more normal than you. His evil was not an innate pathology or sadism. It was the result of a complete, total, absolute absence of thought. He did not think. He simply did his job. This very paradox struck the philosopher Hannah Arendt, sitting in the courtroom, like a physical blow. She realized she was facing something far more terrifying than the familiar, almost comforting image of a textbook villain. She saw a new kind of evil, a faceless evil, a bureaucratic evil, a banal evil. How does an ordinary, unremarkable person, preoccupied with his career, mortgage, and pension, become an architect of genocide? In this film, we will dissect the psychological mechanism that, like a computer virus, infects the conscience and turns ordinary people into executors of the most horrific orders. A mechanism that did not disappear with the Third Reich. It merely went dormant, mutated, and thrives today within the structures of our corporations, armies, and governments. And by the end, you will understand why this threat, the threat of thoughtless obedience, is relevant to you, personally, today, more than ever. 1961, Jerusalem. In a stuffy courtroom sits a woman who herself fled Nazi Germany, the philosopher Hannah Arendt. She has come to cover the trial, expecting, like everyone else, to see an ideological monster, a demonic fanatic whose words would be steeped in the poison of hatred. But instead she sees what she would later call a nobody. She listens to a man whose speech is so cluttered with bureaucratic cliches that he seems physically incapable of forming a single original living sentence. He doesn't speak. He quotes regulations. So who was he, this man in the glass booth? Adolf Eichmann was neither a sadist nor a pathological maniac. He was a failed traveling salesman who had finally found his place. He found himself in the giant, humming machine of bureaucracy. His greatest talent was organization. His passion, his true passion, was efficiency. At his trial, he spoke with unconcealed pride about how brilliantly he had drafted train schedules, how he had optimized logistical flows, how he had calculated the capacity of the camps down to the last person. He was just doing his job. As for what the cargo on those trains and the units in his reports actually were, he tried not to think about that. It was not within his purview. Again and again, like a broken record, he repeated his main point, I was only following orders. And the most terrifying part was that it didn't sound like a cheap excuse. He genuinely believed that fulfilling his duty, meticulously adhering to the letter of the law, was the highest virtue. For him, personal responsibility simply evaporated where a superior's order began. His conscience was crystal clear. After all, he was a good soldier. He was an impeccably efficient bureaucrat. He was an excellent manager. And then Arendt understood. Eichmann's problem was not that he was evil. The problem was that he didn't think. It was a total, absolute absence of thought. In German, Gedankenlosigkeit. He operated with ready-made formulas, slogans, and bureaucratic clichés that served as his armor against reality. And it was this dead bureaucratic language, devoid of any connection to real life, that became the first tool, the cognitive anesthetic, the system used to disable his capacity for empathy. And for thought. Imagine an office, quiet, filled with light, smelling not of blood but of fresh paper and expensive parquet floors. Men in perfectly pressed suits are seated discussing important matters of state. The only sounds are the rustle of documents and the polite scratching of pens. They do not shout. They do not slam their fists on the table. They are not talking about murder. They are talking about logistics, transport quotas, sanitary measures, and of course the final solution to the Jewish question. It sounds like a dull, routine planning meeting at a large, faceless corporation discussing the restructuring of an unprofitable department. This special, hollowed-out language in the Third Reich was called Amtssprache, official language, Bureaucraties. It was a brilliant and monstrous psychological invention created for one purpose, to sever the link between an action and its moral meaning. The word genocide was never used. It was too emotional, too messy. In its place was the cold, technical term, final solution. Murder by gas was not murder, it was called special treatment. Deportation to death camps became resettlement to the east. This language, like a virus, infected the consciousness. It allowed one to speak of the unthinkable without naming it, and therefore without feeling it. And what is astonishing is that this language was needed not so much to deceive the victims as for the total self-deception of the perpetrators themselves. It transformed the act of mass murder into an abstract administrative task, a line in a report, a completed KPI. It allowed Eichmann and thousands like him to return home from work, where they had spent the day moving trains loaded with death across a map, and feel not horror, but professional pride. The pride of having solved a brilliant logistical problem. They kissed their children and slept a deep, untroubled sleep. For they were not murderers. They were just filling out paperwork and optimizing processes. They were effective managers. But this anesthetic language was only one part of a vast machine. A machine designed so that no one would ever feel like a murderer. A machine that didn't just hide personal guilt, but chemically dissolved it within a complex system of orders, departments, and job descriptions. A system where each person sees only their tiny cog, but no one sees the whole guillotine. How did it work? Imagine a massive assembly line, deafening with its rhythmic clatter. One worker monotonously tightens the same bolt, 8 hours a day, 480 minutes. His world is narrowed to that single bolt. He doesn't think about the car. He thinks about not stripping the threads. Another attaches a small, nameless part. A third paints a single panel. None of them creates a car alone. Each performs only one simple, automated, insignificant action. And no one bears full responsibility for the final product. This is precisely how the soulless mechanism of the Holocaust was constructed. Psychologists call this mechanism the diffusion of responsibility. In a complex bureaucratic hierarchy, an order from above, like a stone thrown into water, shatters into hundreds of small, routine tasks. The official, scratching his pen in the quiet of a Berlin office, compiles lists. He doesn't see the faces behind the numbers. To him, it's just a balance sheet, debits and credits. The train engineer, feeling the locomotive's vibration, drives the train east. He only knows the departure and destination points. The cargo is just a word on a shipping manifest. The guard, shivering in the biting wind, stands on a tower at the camp. His job is the perimeter. What happens behind the barbed wire is not his concern. That's another department's job. Each person sees only a tiny fragment of the whole picture. Each can tell himself, I am just a small cog. I am just doing my job. And herein lies the system's diabolical paradox. It makes a person simultaneously insignificant, a mere executor, and part of something grandiose. You are a cog, but you are a cog in a machine building a great future for the nation. Your personal morality, your doubts, yourself, all of it becomes irrelevant noise in the coordinated hum of the great machine. The system offers you a deal. Surrender your conscience to us, and we will give you a sense of purpose, of belonging, of security. And for many, this deal proves too tempting. You cease to be an individual capable of internal dialogue and become a function, a component. But even within such a system, with such a language, how does the human psyche, your psyche, grow accustomed to what seemed monstrous and unthinkable just yesterday? The answer is frighteningly simple, very slowly, step by step, through a process of gradual lulling normalization, a process that begins with something small, something almost innocent. There is a well-known parable about a frog. If you drop it into boiling water, it will feel the burn and instantly jump out. But if you place it in a pot of pleasantly cool water and slowly, almost imperceptibly, raise the temperature degree by degree, it won't notice the mortal danger. It might even enjoy it. Its body will relax in the soothing warmth, and it will be boiled alive, never realizing the moment when comfort turned into a deadly trap. This is precisely how the normalization of evil worked in the Third Reich. No one started with building Auschwitz. No. At first it was just one law, almost reasonable, a ban on Jews holding government positions. Then a sign appeared on a park bench, for Aryans only. Then a ban on attending cinemas. Then a ban on owning pets. Each new step was only slightly worse than the last. Each time society, after some grumbling, grew accustomed to the new, slightly warmer water. The moral compass was knocked off by 1 degree, then another, and another. This mechanism of psychological habituation is called desensitization, the normalization of the unthinkable. Your psyche, like any other, has an amazing capacity for adaptation. What shocks you today becomes a troubling but familiar part of the urban landscape tomorrow. And the day after tomorrow, it's just a gray routine you no longer notice. The yellow star on a neighbor's coat first catches your eye. Then it makes you feel awkward. A month later, it's just part of his attire, like a hat or a coat. And his sudden, quiet disappearance one night no longer causes shock. Just a fleeting worry and tightly drawn curtains on the windows across the street. This process of ethical drift was terrifying because it affected not only perpetrators like Eichmann, it affected the entire society. Millions of ordinary people who were not sadists or fanatics. Step by step, they grew accustomed to the escalating horror. They learned to look away. They remained silent. and their silence became a deafening permission for evil. They became passive but no less crucial accomplices, creating with their apathy, their comfortable ignorance, the very atmosphere in which evil could breathe and grow. The dead anesthetic language. Responsibility dissolved in the system, a gradual poisonous habituation to the unthinkable. All three of these mechanisms were aimed at one thing: to disable the primary human capacity that Hannah Arendt considered the last bastion of morality and the root of humanity, the capacity to think. And for her, to think did not mean solving crossword puzzles. It meant conducting a silent but honest dialogue with oneself, asking simple questions: what am I doing and who am I if I am doing this? In 1963, her book Eichmann in Jerusalem is published, and the world erupts. The intellectual community, which had been expecting a philosophical condemnation of absolute evil, is furious. She is accused of the unthinkable, of trying to understand and therefore excuse a Nazi executioner. Close friends write her scathing letters, reproaching her for a lack of love for the Jewish people. Newspaper headlines scream about the justification of genocide. To everyone, Eichmann was a monster, and any other explanation seemed sacrilegious. Arendt was accused of cold detachment, of an intellectual arrogance that radiated an icy chill. She stood alone against a storm of printed damnations, trying to convey an idea that no one wanted to hear. And that idea was frighteningly simple. Her critics missed the main point. Arendt argued that Eichmann's greatest crime was not sadism or hatred, which, as 6 psychiatric evaluations showed, he simply did not possess. His cardinal sin was total thoughtlessness. In German, Gedankenlosigkeit. And this is not stupidity. It is the complete inability to conduct that internal dialogue with oneself. Eichmann could not stop and ask himself, what am I actually doing? He could not see his actions through the eyes of another. He operated not with morality, but with bureaucratic clichés. He did not think. He functioned flawlessly, and here lies the twist that everyone missed. Hannah Arendt was not excusing Eichmann. She was delivering a verdict far more terrifying than simply monster. To call him a monster is to make him exceptional, inhuman. And in doing so, to protect ourselves by drawing a line, here are we, normal people, and there he is, a fiend from hell. But Arendt said, he is not a monster, he is a nobody, a resounding emptiness in an SS uniform. A criminal not by conviction, but by a complete lack of any convictions. And this means that to commit the greatest evil, a demonic will is not required. Only an absence of thought is needed. And this terrifying potential, this vulnerability to evil, lies dormant, like a sleeping virus, in every ordinary person who refuses to think. This idea seemed too philosophical, almost ephemeral to many. How could one prove that an ordinary mentally sound person is capable of monstrous acts simply by obeying an order? Society needed more than a theory. It needed a graphic, cruel experiment. And by a twist of fate, just 2 years after Eichmann's trial, in the sterile walls of a Yale University laboratory, a young psychologist named Stanley Milgram would provide the world with that proof. Proof that would send a cold shiver of recognition down the world's spine. Imagine a quiet university laboratory, smelling of ozone and old paper. The year is 1963. You, an ordinary person, have been invited to participate in an experiment on the effect of pain on memory. You sit before a massive gray device that hums quietly with a row of metal switches. Each click echoes in the tense silence. The panel is labeled 15 volts, slight shock, 150 volts, strong shock, 300 volts, intense shock, and finally, 450 volts, danger, severe shock. In another room, behind soundproof glass, sits a learner, whom you cannot see but can hear clearly. Your task is to ask him questions. For each mistake, you must flip a switch, increasing the voltage each time. Standing next to you is a man in a perfectly pressed white lab coat. His face is impassive, his voice even and devoid of emotion. He says, "The experiment requires that you continue." This was Stanley Milgram's famous experiment. In reality, he was not studying memory, but obedience to authority. The learner in the other room was an actor, and he received no electric shocks. His cries of pain, pleas for mercy, and finally a dead, frightening silence. It was all just an audio recording. The real question was different. How far would the actual subject, the teacher, go? To what limit is an ordinary person willing to inflict pain on another if an authority figure assumes responsibility? The results shocked everyone. 65% of the participants, ordinary accountants, teachers, engineers, went all the way to the end of the scale, to the lethally dangerous 450 volts, simply because the man in the white coat methodically repeated, "Please continue." But here is the most terrifying detail of this experiment, captured on film. The subjects were not sadists. They took no pleasure in it. On the contrary, they licked their dry lips, dug their nails into their palms. Their speech became halting. They argued with the experimenter, begging him to stop. They said, "I can't do this, he's in pain." Their conscience was screaming, producing a physiological reaction, but they kept pressing the button. In that moment, what Milgram would later call a shift to the agentic state occurred. A short circuit in the chain of personal conscience. Their sense of compassion lost the battle against a deeply ingrained reflex to obey authority. They transferred responsibility to the man in the white coat, becoming merely a conduit for another's will. Adolf Eichmann was not an exception to the rule. Milgram's experiment proved it vividly. Eichmann, with his babbling about fulfilling his duty, was the rule demonstrated under sterile laboratory conditions. His behavior was not a pathology, but a fundamental vulnerability of the human psyche, built into our neurobiology, which is activated under specific conditions. Conditions where there is an order, an authority, and a complete removal of personal responsibility. But that was then. In an era of totalitarian regimes and rigid hierarchies, how does this vulnerability manifest today in our seemingly free, transparent, and decentralized digital world? A modern office with panoramic windows. A manager asks you to optimize the numbers in a report, looking not at you, but at his laptop screen. It's not his decision, it's an order from above, a social network. One careless comment, and suddenly thousands of faceless avatars driven by collective anger are typing death threats. Each of them is just a drop in a torrent of hatred. A military bunker. A drone operator in an air-conditioned room thousands of miles from the target smoothly moves a joystick and presses a button. On his thermal imaging screen, there are just blurry white pixels. It's not murder, it's the neutralization of a target. The scenery has changed, but the mechanisms are the same. Diffusion of responsibility, you blame the manager blames the director. The participant in the online mob feels innocent because everyone is doing it. Bureaucraties, the same Amtssprache Arendt wrote about, has mutated. Instead of falsifying reports, we have creative accounting. Instead of mobbing, we have restoring justice. Instead of killing, we have executing a combat mission. Evil once again becomes routine, a banality. But there is a new, frightening difference. In the 20th century, the authority was a person, a Führer, a scientist in a white lab coat. Today, the role of authority is increasingly played by a cold, impersonal system. A corporate policy written in hundreds of pages of guidelines that no one reads. The black box of an algorithm that, in its goal of maximizing engagement, feeds us increasingly radical content. The social pressure that forces silence for fear of cancellation. Obeying has become even easier. Because now it's often unclear whom you are obeying. You become a cog in a machine that has no face, no conscience, and no capacity for dialogue. You are just executing code. The machine that produces banal evil has not disappeared. It is not rusting in museums. It has simply swapped its bulky steel casings for sleek glass interfaces and cloud servers. It has become more invisible, more efficient. It hums in our pockets, glows from our screens, and is embedded in our work processes. It is everywhere. So what can we do to counter it? Is there an antidote to this quiet, systemic poison? Let's summarize. The concept of the banality of evil is not an excuse. It is a precise, almost medical diagnosis. It states the most terrible crimes in history are committed not by maniacs or sadists. They are committed by ordinary people caught in a system that acts as an anesthetic for the conscience, a system that disables their primary human capacity to think. Evil, as Arendt showed, is not an active virus. It is a system failure. The default state of consciousness, the very sleep of reason that, as Goya said, produces monsters. Hannah Arendt, having endured a storm of misunderstanding, left the world with more than just a scandalous theory. She left a warning, and at the same time a single, incredibly powerful tool of resistance. This weapon is the ability to conduct a dialogue with oneself, the ability to stop in the middle of carrying out an order, in the midst of the general flow, and ask oneself simple questions. What am I doing? Why am I doing it? And the most ruthless one, will I be able to live with myself after this? To look in the mirror and recognize the person I see there. This is thinking in Arendt's sense. And it is not a privilege of philosophers. It is moral hygiene, a daily duty for everyone. And herein lies the main stunning lesson. The opposite of evil is not good. Good is often passive, conformist. One can be good simply by following the rules of etiquette. The opposite of evil is thought, a conscious, effortful, often uncomfortable and agonizing act of making sense of reality. The only true defense against slipping into banal evil is the constant, tireless work of the consciousness. It is that inner conversation which Eichmann was organically incapable of, whose inner world was deaf and mute. And it is the last line of defense separating us from becoming a function. Now stop for a moment. Feel your own heartbeat. Recall the sound of your own voice when you said, "I was just doing my job." Those are the rules. Everyone does it. Was that just a harmless formality? Or did that phrase hide the very click of an internal switch, the moment you voluntarily outsourced your conscience? It is in these small daily moments, in these barely perceptible compromises, that the thin, vibrating line is drawn. The line between thought and its absence, between responsibility and evil, which is always so banal.